Well, here we are again. I'm standing on Lance Nest, and don't worry, we're coexisting. Now, I'm sure you're sick of hearing the phrase, we're the best in the world, this is the best country in the world. But I've got a bit of sympathy with those people who have got those ideas, because we could be one of the best countries in the world, and that's the key. Could be. You have a lot of negatives, but you also have a lot of positives. Unfortunately, in 2022, the negatives outweigh the positives. But it shouldn't be that way. It should never have been that way. And we need to go back to the very beginning, when this continent was populated by people who'd been here over 60,000 years, who'd lived here continuously for over 60,000 years in over 250 sovereign nation states with distinct cultures, languages, mythology, religious beliefs, methods of surviving. So when the Europeans first came here, the colonisation process was built on the concept of Terra Nullius, the land of no one. And of all the British colonies, this was the only one where a treaty wasn't entered into with the original inhabitants. So I think the first stumbling block we need to clamber over, and the key word is clamber, is our relationship with this country's First Nations people. And if we can resolve that issue to the satisfaction of both this country's First Nation people and the rest of the community, both born in this country and immigrants who've come from overseas, we'll be on a solid platform to make this one of the best places in the world. But you need that solid platform. And unless we take notice of the Uluru statement from the heart when delegates from Indigenous groups across the country met at Uluru to hammer out a compromise negotiation package, which was summarily dismissed by the Liberal National government within a few days. If we don't accept that premise of truth-telling, of working towards a treaty, we will never be able to become one of the great countries in the world. Because in order to be a great country, you need to be able to reconcile with the past and make amends for the atrocities of the past. That's the first thing. The second problem we face is the fact that this continent changed course in the late 1970s and 1980s. Up to the 1970s and 1980s, we had the classical disputes between Labor and capital. But Labor was winning, not in terms of parliamentary representation, but in terms of conditions, wages for people who have to sell their labour in order to survive. So we saw many developments in this country which were the envy of the rest of the world. For example, the setting of a minimum wage during the harvester case, the Sunshine Harvester case in 1905. The fact that we introduced a universal pension system. The fact that a social security system was created to look after the needs of those who had difficulty looking after themselves. The fact that we had a representative democracy. With all its flaws, it still was a democracy. And the fact that we had many nationalised essential services like gas, electricity. We had a privatised Commonwealth, we had a public bank, the Commonwealth Bank, public telecommunications, the old Telecom, a public airline, the old Qantas, a public Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, And the list goes on and on. So in many regards, the 1960s and 1970s, although we didn't see them as such during that period, could be described as the golden years. In the 1960s, a single wage earner in a family unit could save enough money to buy a home in 7 years. I'll repeat it again. A single wage earner in a middle income job could actually buy a home in 7 years. It's difficult enough finding a deposit, let alone buy a home in 7 years in 2022, where property prices have increased far outstripped any wage gains. Wage gains have increased by about 10-fold, while property prices have increased by about 50-fold. So where did things start to go wrong? I'm not saying the 60s and 70s were perfect. Obviously they weren't perfect. There were many issues. We hadn't grappled with the issue of sexual abuse. We hadn't grappled with the issue of gender inequality, the issue of people of different sexuality. We hadn't even thought of the issue of dealing with this country's First Nations people. So there are many, 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 many social cultural issues which we had not tackled, which are being tackled to some degree, obviously, in 2022. But in terms of using the Commonwealth for the common good, we have slipped far behind many other so-called developed nations. And we have slipped so far behind that an increasing number of Australians have no future. Because when you look at Australian society, you can divide it into 4 groups. The first one is the 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And in that 1%, there's a 0.01% that owns about 40% of everything in this country. Then we've got the 8 to 10% of Australians who have disposable income, who can invest, use capital to make a profit and increase their options. The more capital they have, the more disposable income, the greater their ability to enjoy the so-called good things in life. Then we have the bulk of the population, about 50 to 60% wage earners. Many are labouring or working in part-time, insecure, poorly paid work. And that's why, to a large degree, so many industries post-COVID-19 are having so much trouble finding labour. It's not a matter of a lack of labour, it's a matter of a lack of wages and conditions which attract labour. That's the issue. So we could become a great country. And then we've got the 4th group, the 30% of Australians who rely on social security benefits to survive. People on old age pensions, people on disability support pensions, people on single parents pensions. And they have been at the very front line of a war which the state has been waging during the neoliberal privatisation, deregulation, globalisation, corporatisation period. They've been at the front line. They have been the great losers. As it's becoming more and more difficult to access social security benefits, and when you've accessed them, you spend a significant part of your life trying to retain them, especially if you're on a New Start allowance or to some degree on a disability support pension. So we've seen government initiatives and government policies which are designed to drive people into poorly paid, insecure, part-time work. At the same time in this country, we've seen the growth of the private investment for private profit brigade. We now have governments and treasurers, as we spoke about last week, who think the primary job of a government is to keep out of the way of business as it tries to maximise its profits at the expense of the people in this country as well as the environment. So a ridiculous situation in 2022 where Australia's living standards are slipping, but more importantly, where insecurity has become a way of life. Insecurity as far as your job is concerned, as most jobs, including government jobs, are based on short-term contracts. We find ourselves in a situation where striking outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period is illegal in this country, and unions through legislation have been pushed into a corner so they can't actually respond to their members' needs. We've seen a culture, an individualist culture, grow and grow and grow in this country, which doesn't say, what can the country do for me? It doesn't say, what can I do for the country, but it continues to say, what does the country do for me? And to a significant degree, this has occurred because of the private investment for private profit philosophy, ideology, which governs everything that happens in this country. When you see the disasters that occur in the aged care facilities, when you see the problems with the public health system, the problems with public education, and when you see the amount of taxpayers' money which is given to the private sector to provide basic services to the public on behalf of the government of the day, you begin to understand there are major issues in this country, and we can never be a great country which looks after the needs of its people and which is able to create wealth and assist the nation states around us. We can never do that unless we tackle the central mantra, the central belief, the central ideology which drives every government initiative, which drives opposition legislative tactics, and that is total support by the government and the taxpayer for the private investment for private profit model. So how do we become a great country? The first thing we should think of is a universal basic income. A universal basic income provides a reasonable standard of living for each and every Australian. It can be financed through a 1% stock market turnover tax or a 1% plus a 1% financial transaction tax. It can be done tomorrow. It doesn't need blood in the streets or a revolution. All it needs is a legislative agenda. We can resolve the issue of reconciliation, the issue of signing a peace treaty with this nation's First Nations people and move forward. That can be done tomorrow. There's an increasing number of Australians who think it should be done tomorrow as the resistance to the 26th of January being Australia Day grows. Then we need to look at all the restrictive legislations which have been placed on trade unions which prevent them from collectively bargaining to look after the interests of their members. That type of legislation should be scrapped. We shouldn't have selective legislation which is designed to only affect members of the CFMEU. I mean, we think of ourselves as a great country and we have selective legislation designed to minimise the ability of people to collectively bargain to improve their situation. The other thing we should be looking at is a disaster management centre, a national disaster management centre. We find our response to COVID-19, to bushfires, to floods, to cyclones, to tornadoes is all very piecemeal. The people of Bega in southern New South Wales have tossed out their Liberal candidate at the state election this weekend because they were forgotten. They were the forgotten people during the great bushfires of 2019. If we had a centralised disaster management centre which crosses state boundaries, which has a centre established for each 500,000 people, that's 50 disaster management centres which can actually provide that surge workforce that people talk about, which is financed by the government of the day at the state and federal level, we wouldn't have this stop-start progress as far as responding to national emergencies are concerned. We should be looking at recreating publicly owned facilities that look after essential services like electricity, gas, energy, pharmaceuticals, quarantine centres, and the list goes on and on. We should be looking at the type of economy you have. Not an economy which is based on private investment for private profit, but a mixed economy based on a private investment for private profit model for non-essential services, a public model for essential services, and we should see the growth of a cooperative and collective model which can directly compete with the corporate sector. It's no accident today when you walk into a shopping centre anywhere in Australia, it's the same corporations which govern the way we live in terms of what we purchase, how we purchase it. So to a significant degree we do have options. And last but not least, we should seriously think about nationalising this country's resources, or at least increasing the tax base, 80% for the people, 20% for the corporations as far as profits are concerned, which are developing these mineral resources. Because ultimately, what's under the earth, the Commonwealth, belongs to all of us. It doesn't belong to the Crown. It belongs initially to this country's First Nations people and to all of us. If the profits which are made from the mining sector, which only employs 2% of the population, were distributed fairly amongst First Nations people and the rest of the population, I can assure you most of the problems which we face now as a nation wouldn't occur. We wouldn't have private charities raising money to send Australian children to public schools. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. We wouldn't have people homeless. We'd see much more resources go into providing public housing for people. Because it's not just a matter of renting and owning, it's a matter of housing security. And whether you rent or own, the essential thing is security. Renters in this country, which is over 40% of the population, don't have housing security. People in the diminishing public housing sector do have some security compared to those in private rent. They can send their children to the same schools, the same sporting clubs. They can make friendships with the people around them. And especially if you have a spot purchasing scheme which spot purchases properties in regional and major cities across the country. Why shouldn't we have a national public housing sector? Why should it be left up to the individual states to provide this essential commodity for people? And ultimately, we need a people's bank, like the previously nationally owned Commonwealth Bank, to provide loans to people who are now not able to obtain loans because they don't actually have the financial security and stability for the private banks to provide them with resources to improve their lives. So there are many, many, many things you or I can do. Public interest before corporate interest was established to push forward that agenda, the agenda of public housing, the agenda of public health, the agenda of public education, the agenda of coming to some type of reconciliation with this country's First Nations people through a treaty process, whether it's through the individual tribes or the country as a whole, is a matter which will be determined as we progress along that road. Policies regarding us using the profits that are made from the resources which are found in the ground, used for the benefit of all Australians, not just billionaires who then strut around, in some cases being philanthropists, in other cases keeping every bloody cent for themselves to maximise their power. to influence the legislative agenda. And that's what it's about ultimately. Who has the power to influence the legislative agenda in this country? With the 2022 election coming up, federal election coming up in May, you can see who has the power. That small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And when I talk about communication, I talk about the World Wide Web, as well as newspapers, radio, television, Instagram, TikTok, and the list goes on and on. These are the organisations which help set the agenda. And if we sit back and refuse to do nothing and shrug our shoulders and think that all we have to do is cast a ballot every 3 to 4 years, nothing will ever change. I encourage you to look at our website, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, pipsi.net. If you like what you see, download the application form. If you don't like what you see, I recommend you find organisations and groups which reflect your opinions, because without your participation in the political, social and cultural life of this country, nothing will ever change.